Hello everyone, it's Sophie here from farmerswife. We're going to have a session today on financial reports and going to be some tips and tricks and give everyone an introduction to start using the financial reports. Now, my name is Sophie. Some of you may know me. I've been working with farmerswife for a long time, most recently here in LA, but before that I was in the London office. But I am from neither of those countries. I'm actually Danish, so I've been around a bit. Now, let's have a look at these financial reports and what they can do for us in our farmerswife desktop client. So, financial reports are used for two main purposes. One is to have the system to have a tool to let us print some nice reports that we can show to our clients. For example, budget reports or invoice reports. That's two ways that we would use the financial reports. But also, and very importantly, farmerswife's financial reports designer lets us design and wrangle data from the system that we can then turn into reports that are printable. So this is where we can run sort of statistical reports, we can run utilization reports, and crunch numbers in a tool that lets us also print it if we need to, or export it to CSV. We're not going to spend too much time looking at other reports, but you all know, or most of you will know, that there are also these other types of reports that we could spend a lot of time on. We call them user reports and object reports, and we call them area reports, and those areas will mostly be projects and invoices. So it's two different strands that basically leads us down to the print designer in various ways. But the financial reports tool is a very powerful tool that lets us choose how we want to break the data down when we select our input, and also have a lot more control over how and where and what is going to be displayed in the print designer page when we get to that stage. So I'm just going to jump back here to the PowerPoint, because to describe the financial reports, there are ultimately 3 steps, especially when you're starting out creating a new template. And those 3 steps are simply the input that you select, the financial reports groupings and settings in the financial reports settings window, and then there's the print designer, which is the last step before printing. So those 3 steps are needed when you need to create a new template. Once the template is created, you are able to select the input and then select the template and then run the report. So the steps are a little bit faster. If you're running reports from the invoice window, or if you're running reports from the budget window, you will be able to go directly from the budget or invoice window straight to the reports template. So it's automatically using those 2 sections as input and straight into your report. So it's a little bit faster. But creating a new template will require 3 steps, and we're going to look at those 3 steps in detail. Now, the first thing we need to talk about in financial reports are what input do we need to the report, or what input can farmerswife use in a financial report. And it is, as you can see in this list here, basically every single component that is farmerswife. So we'll be able to run reports based on budgets, containers, projects and binders, selected bookings, contacts, selected objects, and selected invoices. That can all form the basis, the input basis for our report. So let's look at what that looks like in this version here. So when I'm looking at the interface of farmerswife, very often we would select projects to be input to our report, and we can use the toolbox as the input selector for projects, or we can use the advanced project search where we can narrow in on a bunch of projects in more detail. If we select Advanced Project Search here and we look at our project search fields, we'll be able to combine a search to find very specific required projects. Or we could use our toolbox and just select everything, maybe everything that's currently active and so on. And that could form the basis for our report. So as I select my reports here or my projects, I will right click and I have the option to financially report on the selected projects. If I do that, it'll take me into what we call step 2. And step 2 is the financial report settings that we'll come to in a moment. Another very classic input selector for the reports are objects, because very often we want to run reports based on activity by specific objects. That could, for example, be all our edit bays, for example. So we'd be able to mark those, and then we can run reports on those and their activity over a selected period of time. Because when you select objects for your financial report, farmerswife doesn't know what period of time you want to use, whereas a project has a natural start and end date or end period, and so that date range would already at that point be defined. But here, farmerswife will ask us, okay, what period of time do you want me to look at activity for to include in the report? So here we'd select the start and end date of that period, and then you click OK, and then that opens up into the financial reports settings, where you would then either create a new report or select one of your templates to run those at this point. Those are the two probably main inputs to reports, but there are many others. And so if we were standing inside a project, we could also run a report with input just from this project. We have the little reports button in the bottom right corner, and that could take us with the input just from this project into the financial reports window, and then we could select our report from there and run it. But we also here have our budget module, and if I'm standing inside a budget and I want to run a report from it here, then I would select it from the little quick pick list. So I have some reports I've already made available. It will take me straight into the print designer for these reports. Or I can go into the financial reports and select one that I haven't added to my quick pick list here. This is what I mentioned earlier about the first, this is kind of one of the first uses that you have of the financial reports, is to make a pretty report that looks nice when you print it, and that's acceptable and easy on the eye to your clients in particular. So if I run something from this here, it takes me straight into the print designer for this budget through the financial reports. The report has already been designed, so it already knows where all the values are being displayed, and it looks very neat, and we can print it to PDF and send it to our client. I can show a couple of more examples up here. This is a different layout. It's still drawing on the same data from the same budget. It's just been designed slightly differently. You can go to the last one here and see what we have. Yeah, so again, a little bit more detail, maybe a few more notes and so on. So 3 different examples of what these reports could look like. So this is more displaying data that we have as opposed to crunching numbers in a report, like a utilization report and so on. Okay, so if we look at making a nice, just a standard report on a project. So we could go into I Love Music. No, let's take I Love Music. Go into the report, and then from here I've already said this project and all its data is going to be the input to my report. So when we're standing in the financial reports window, we then have to select, if we're creating a new template, we're going to select how we want to break the totals down. What do we want what numbers do we want to see in our report? this little green plus will bring us in to create a new report. So we can call this one new project report, or we can call this project breakdown or something like this. And we can write a description, which is actually super helpful when it comes to describing what the intention was for a report like this. But I want to show you these three groupings. They are very key to making a report, because this is how you're telling farmerswife, first show me this total, then break that total into this total, and then break it into this total. So when we look at the list of options we have in each of these groupings, 1, 2, and 3, you'll see that there's a lot of data available in here. So not only is it different components of the system, so you're all most of you are familiar with these concepts, but we can break the data, the totals down into the total per project, or the total per object, or whatever we want farmerswife to, however we want it to grab the data that we inputted from that project. Now, you'll also see at the bottom here that we have custom fields that are basically all these custom fields that you have added to your databases. They become criteria for financial reporting as well. So that is what makes this financial reports tool very scalable and very heavy duty. So if we're standing in a financial report, if we wanted to, we could, if we're standing in the custom field on the project, we have all these different custom fields that I'm sure you're all using in your databases to both share data with each other and anyone who's looking at the project, but also as a way of capturing and being able to run these different reports. So project type is a classic one. If you have, this is potentially how you're saying what kind of jobs are coming through your company and what revenue streams are there. So maybe you want to see, well, what kind of projects are bringing in more profit to the business. So we'd be able to run a report based on that. But as you know, there's custom fields available for every single item in the system, more or less. So we have the booking reports here. These are the source custom fields. We have the custom fields that are sitting inside the budget, and then we have custom fields we can add to the invoice. And obviously we have a lot of information we could add onto projects, and some of that information could, for example, be custom fields we want to run reports on. So there's a lot of scope, and I encourage you all to spend some time thinking about what kind of reports you might have, and maybe you need to create some more custom fields in order to run the reports that you need. I actually personally often use my notepad to sketch out what kind of report I need, and that will often tell me what my groupings need to be. So that is another tip that you might use, where you can sort of write out, identify what information you want to see and how you want to break it down, and then you'd be able to work your way backwards from there into building your report. So we could do something very simple where we just said we just want to see a total for this project, and when we get into the report we say we just want to display maybe the buy rate versus the sell rate. So that could become like a little P&L report, like a little profit and loss report or statement that you have. This report is just for one project, obviously, so it'll just have one line in it showing us the total value. So we can, in our description here, we can say one or more projects selected in toolbox. So then we know how are we supposed to, what was the intentional input to the report when we created this report. Let's put the word report there, that helps. Okay, so that is sort of call it the first portion of creating a new template. These, once you've created the groupings, they are fixed. You can't change them later on. If you want a different report that have a different breakdown, you would create a new report. And this happens especially in the beginning when you're getting to grips and learning the tool. You would probably run lots of different reports and realize, oh, it's not quite breaking it down the way I wanted it, or the data that I need isn't quite where I need it. Maybe I'll try a different way to construct the report to see if I can get the numbers to show in the places where I need them. So there's can be a little bit of back and forth at the beginning when you're just getting to know the tool a bit better. And we still, all of us, even us that have been here for a long time, we still have to try again to make sure that we've got it exactly right. So even though we sketched it out on our notepads first, or think that we've planned it well, then we still might have to do a couple of tries before we get it just right. But for each report, we also have some other settings here. So in the top right corner here, we have some filters that talk about what items and what lines of should be included in the report. So we are able to say, from the input I gave the report, which in our case was the project, maybe we only want to look at specific objects, so we'll be able to select those from this drop-down. So we come into the object browser here, and then we'd be able to select maybe just the edit base, or maybe just editors from different categories that we have, or the different types of objects that we have in the database. Or you can search for them by name. So if I wanted to find my edit items, I'd be able to say, I want to run reports specifically on these items. So that's how you'd use that. You can also say, I want to run report on anything that come from a specific class. So then you get the selector again, but now you're selecting a different specific class for your report rather than individual objects. And then you have a setting here that says what the criteria needs to be if the objects or classes that you selected have to be in the event for the data to show in the report. The next one here is quite important as well, because this is where you can further define a date range for your report. Now, the financial lines and range is a way for you to say, I want to see everything from this project, but I don't want to see every date in the report. I'm only interested in seeing any activity that any of the objects or line items that this project had that happened in a certain period of time. So this is where you can even further define which date or what date period you want to show. So if you have a very large project, or if you want to run this report very frequently, you might run this report with the same input each week, but you would change the date range depending on what week you were in. And then farmerswife is going to show anything that happened in this project, any data that was available, but only looking at anything that happened in this period of time. So this could be any arbitrary period that you select for a week or a month or 6 weeks or 10 months or whatever it needs to be. There's a new setting as well that we added for as a custom development recently. If it's very important that you only see weekdays, farmerswife will actually let you exclude the weekends and holiday days, like the public holidays that you have, from the report. So it's automatically going to skip all these white days and the red vacation days or public holidays that you've added to your system. So this will look at what your toolbox settings are and suggest the same default as you have there. But you can turn it on and off independently whenever you run the report. So that is a way to further define what data you want farmerswife to focus in on. I'm going to take it off for this report because it's a fairly small project. The next section we have here is the general settings. And in the general settings, we are going to affect what we call the row section that every report has, which I will explain once we look at the report. But The row section is basically looking at objects or the line items from the input that you gave. So the sources that you have that can contain input is your bookings mostly, but it can also be services, materials, and expenses you added directly into the project, or it can come from media orders, or it can come from project work orders. So that's what we call sources. And then you are able to say, these objects or these items that I'm going to be showing, am I going to mix them onto the same line if they have different units? Am I going to mix them onto one line if they have multiple dates? Or am I going to not? Am I going to show each line one line per date, basically? And then if the object has been used in multiple sources, do I want to smash the lines into one line per object, regardless of what source it came from? So if an editor was booked in a booking, but also appeared in a project work order, if I selected this, it would put that same editor into one line and then calculate the units as a total, as opposed to showing first one line for the editor in the project work order and then another line for the editor in the booking. So that's what that is. These two over here are if you have projects that are using markers and binders and you want to show them in your report as well. And then you have this section, which I'm sure many of you have met before, because farmerswife in many places let you hide items that have no sell rate or that has a 0 sell rate. So you might have some items that you need to book in your system, for example, an editor or an edit bay. They both need to appear in the booking, but one of them might have a 0 sell rate because it's included in the rate of the other item. So you need it for the booking, but you don't necessarily need to show it to your client, or you don't need to include it when you look at the report. If you have lots of items that you're not charging for specifically, but you need to track for utilization purposes, or to make sure that that person knows what they're working on or what room they have to be in, it's very handy that you can exclude those items, because they won't necessarily make a difference to the bottom total rate for the project. So in this instance, you could easily say, don't show the lines that don't have a rate. There's a little caveat setting here that says only force the 0 sell if I have given that item 100% discount. So instead of blanket hiding all the zeros, it will only hide the zeros that didn't have 100% discount. It could be if you wanted to show the client how nice you were being to them, or how much time was spent by people, for example, in your to complete his project, then you could set the item to 100% discount and still show that there was 10 hours or 20 hours or 5 days used for that item. So it's a way of hiding or showing sell rates based on criteria. Then we have the setting here that says empty groups are last or first, and that means that if any of the items that we have in our input to the report falls outside of the groupings or the groups that we've asked farmerswife to break the data down in, if any of those group items don't fall within that group, then is farmerswife going to show those items at the top of the list, or in the top of the report, or at the bottom? So this is just a way of saying, if you have an uncategorized item, where should it list itself in the report? Then we have this last one here. This very probably not used so much anymore, but we have the ability to add sell price operators inside a project window. So it was the old way for farmerswife to sort of give a blanket discount or a percentage discount on something, and it would just apply itself to the bottom or to the total of the project. And then this will allow the system to split the value of it onto separate lines. Will it just be one line by itself, or should we add it to the value of the financial lines, so the objects that were used, and so distributing the value across many lines rather than just as a total. And then we have a very nice new value that we can run in the report, or a grouping. I'll show it here. We can now run reports based on week number and month. And in order to run that effectively, we want to say we don't want to include all the days in a multi-day booking if those days fall outside of a specific month that we're running the report on. So we are saying to farmerswife, split the bookings. This is happening in the background, but it's going to split the bookings and see them as individual days, and then it's going to distribute those days onto the applicable month. So when you run a report on January, February, March, and you have bookings that fall into each of those, but that might be all part of the same booking, farmerswife will calculate it correctly. You might have seen the setting on the booking level as well, and some of you have maybe even set it to be the default. But if you haven't, this would be a way to split the days into separate days so that the month or week report will count the days correctly. Okay, so these were all about the line items when we look at them in the report, so the objects in the row section when we look at the report in a minute. This section here is basically our quick pick lists that we saw earlier. So we can have for the budgeting, when we're standing inside the budget window and we click to run a report, we'll be able to add this particular report to that quick pick list if it's applicable. So you just check the box and then it will appear and you can run it directly from inside the budget. And the same for invoicing reports. If you're building invoicing reports through the financial tool, then you'll be able to have a quick pick list for the report here. Now, the bottom section is talking about where to draw certain values from. So first of all, you can say, does this report include actuals? And if it's a budget report, it probably wouldn't include actuals, so it would just include budgeted. But in some reports where you want to compare budgeted versus used, you need to have both included. And then you need to tell farmerswife where the numbers for the actuals should come from. And this may be familiar to you. From the project window, there's a project view selector where you've defined what lines of data should show up. So is it pointing to lines from the booking? Is it pointing to lines from the budget? And so on. So each of these filters do something different. So very often when we set up new clients with the budget module, we'll always add an actuals view because sometimes you might want to invoice your budget and sometimes you might want to invoice what you used. So that would mean that this invoice filter in your project sometimes points, in some projects it will point to budgets and some projects will point to invoices. That means it's not consistently looking at bookings. So in order to make sure that our actuals are always looking at bookings, we'll have a special filter that points just to bookings. If you don't have the budget module, or if you only ever invoice what you use, then you could also use the to invoice invoiced view. But it's nice to be able to separate the two so that this could always send the right lines to your invoice, but the actuals will always point to bookings, just the same as your budget will always point to budget lines. So this is important. Also important if you haven't got any bookings and you're trying to run a report on and including actuals. That could be a reason why something's not showing up, is because you're pointing to the wrong filter in your template. So that's a little troubleshooting tip that you can come back to. We also have the include quoted, and this is if you are not using the budgeting but you are doing certain quotes from your the virtual bookings, then you'd have include those lines from there, and you can then also can see here that will be drawing from a specific filter that you've created inside the project. So that's something that you'll need to set up correctly. So we can include both. farmerswife will only show the available numbers that we have, so we don't have a budget. There won't be any values available to us to show from those sections. But let's run the report here and see what happens. The first thing that happens when you come into a new report that you never run before is blank space. But that's just because you haven't told farmerswife or the print designer where you want to show the data. So you'd have to start using your sections here on the left-hand side, and then you simply start selecting the values you want to show on the page. And once you've selected them, you can move them around on the page. So we could, for example, start with a header for this report. I'm going to click on this little green plus that lets me add a text value or a rectangle. And I'm going to put a text line that says project report. And then we could say booked versus used. So this would be a report that where I could compare what I booked versus what was time reported. We can also make it a little bigger up here. So I have all these different formatting options up here. What font I want, what size, what color I want the text to be, and if it's bold or italic. And then some other settings that if I wanted a different character spacing, or if I wanted the line height in a note field, for example, to be a little higher, I could change that here. Or I could also very quickly set everything to all caps. It's actually super handy. Okay, so you'll also see this position, and I will, as soon as I click OK, you'll see what that means. So here's the text I wrote. If I select it, it highlights with the little yellow square, and it highlights in the list with in blue. So I always know what section or what group my value is being displayed in, and exactly which element it is. So that's what this is. And I can grab hold of this little yellow square and I can move it around the page. And now you see the little coordinates will change depending on whether I move it horizontally or vertically. So if I double click back onto the little yellow square, or I click on the little edit button, I have access to my little formatting window, and this is where the position is. So very often, if you want to line certain things up and you don't want to continue to drag things around, you could also just type the coordinate that you needed it to sit on, and then it'll jump into there. Now that we're looking at this window, sort of generically, in the top left we have all the templates that have the same groupings. So this is where all the reports where we were grouping by project, they will all sit in this top left section here. There's a little drop-down button where you can import or export reports that you have created or others have created, or if you have had some help from the farmerswife team, they can send you a report. And if it's grouped correctly, you can then import the report that they created for you. And then you can hide other people's templates, and then we can also create group templates where we have multiple pages, but they're designed differently. So it's a way of designing page 1 and page 2, top sheet and secondary pages, and then link them together as a group template. And if I move across here to the right-hand side, I'll be able to set the format here. It's very standard set to letter for the American formats, and A4 for most of the rest of the world. So it's A4 format, and then farmerswife will set the list according to that, or set the sizing of the page. You also have this option for fine adjusting, and this is in relation to how fast or what increments I should move in when I move around on the page. So if you look 480, it jumps 10 pixels every time I try and move it. If I fine adjust, it's going to move 1 pixel at a time. So it's much more fine-tuned like this. I could use my arrow keys on up and down, left and right on the keyboard. So right now I'm on 92, and I prefer a round number, so I'm going to use my up arrow and just go up 2 clicks, and then it jumps up 2 pixels. And then I can set it to come out of fine adjust. So there's a little fine tuning that you can do there. And then depending on how big your screen is, you can scale up or down to have a look at the page and the design in bigger size and so on. Especially also good for fine tuning if you wanted to make sure that you had everything lined up exactly right. But it's also nice to scale down a little bit so you can actually see the whole page. Okay, so the left-hand side is obviously the most intimidating and the most powerful of the tool here. So the middle section is where we see all the values that we are selecting, and on the left-hand side are all the items that are available to us. And every single report, no matter what groupings you will have a header, and I'm just going to scroll down here, and you'll have a rows section. The rows pertain to objects that were included in the data selection. And then you'll have, at the very bottom, you'll have a footer. So those are the 3 components that every single financial report will have. If you then have a grouping or multiple groupings, you can have up to 3. You will then see grouping 1, 2, and 3 underneath each other. So then you keep scrolling down. So you have grouping 1, 2, and 3. And then you come down, then you'll have the rows. And underneath rows, you'll then have the totals for your 3 groupings. And really, it's the same numbers that you have in the top sections, but it's just whether you're displaying it above all the detail or below all the detail. So if I wanted to see the total in the top line of the header, or if I wanted to see it in the bottom beneath all the detail as a sum of the values that I'm showing. So we'll look at that in a minute. So this is our project report, booked versus used. So all I have to do now is go to the section where I want to display data from and select. So as you get too familiar with using the tool, you'll have description in every section is more or less the same as name. It is technically a compound value. In this case, it's the name of the project and the name of on the number of the project. So here's the project name, and then this is the tip I can give you for this is don't be intimidated by the amount of values available. Just take a deep breath and then start to look at the list one by one, because it is very self-explanatory what it is that you're showing. So as soon as you nobody can remember every single value, so there's even the farmerswife experience team will have to sort of look through the list, because you can never memorize exactly where or what values are available. So to a degree, you'll just have to spend a little time looking at the list. But ultimately, if you wanted to, you look down the list and you see, okay, do I need to display any other values with the project name? Maybe I want to show the client name or the company name for the client, so I can show that next to it. So you see, I'm dragging the company name next in the same coordinate line, 80 and 80, to show it in the same line as my project name. I could also have showed it below if I wanted to, so that's up to me and what I want my design to be. But the header has promised us booked versus used. So I'm going to scroll down here, down to all these, through all these different sections, and then you'll get to the bottom where you have some little some sections that have a fold out button or like a little expand arrow. And they'll all start with the word totals, and then you'll see in brackets to invoice used booked, used booked, etc. And this is farmerswife's way of telling you how it's going to draw the numbers that it is available to it. So if we use this one for a moment, when you make a booking, farmerswife will know the booked number, but that could sit there for a while without being time reported. So in this context, farmerswife would know the book number, but not yet the used, not the time reported. But if it knows both the booked and the time reported after the booking was time reported, it's going to take the used number out of the two. So it's a little bit like a hierarchy, and farmerswife is telling you, I'm going to pick this number first if it's available. If I don't have it, I will take this number, and if it isn't available, I will take this number. So we're here talking about actuals. So this is all about booked lines and time report, the time report window that you may all be familiar with, that has 3 columns. The right-hand side will have the booked, the left-hand side will have the used, and to invoice will sit in the middle. So that's how farmerswife selects the values. So if you want to use the most up-to-date number available, then you should use this section of numbers to display. When you open the section, you also see lots of different values. And again, don't let yourself be intimidated by the number of items available, because you know what they all are. Because when you read them, you know what the buy is, you know what the sell is, you know what the total or the quantities mean, etc. So that is really just read each one, and then you'll start to feel much better about what you're seeing. But because in this instance, because I want to compare my booked numbers versus the used numbers, I don't want to take this graded value. I want to isolate those numbers in 2 separate lists. And I have that availability here, the booked only numbers, the used only numbers, etc. I could also compare it with my budgeted numbers if it was available, and even if I had invoiced anything from this project, I'd be able to compare those numbers as well. So you can see that there's a lot of scope when we want to wrangle the numbers in our report. So I'm going to go here to this little section. I'm going to select the sell total, and then I'm going to line that up in line 80. I can put some headers on in a minute. Next to that, I want to show what was time reported. So it could be a used to date report as well. So I select the same value, sell total, but this time the used value. And you can see there's quite a difference, because maybe not a lot of items in this project have been time reported yet. So far, the total of bookings is 2,296, and the total of what's been used in the project is 49. So a very big discrepancy. I can then go in and add a third line here, and then I can make a little formula on that line that deducts the 2 numbers so we can see what the difference was. That will be a way to do that. So this is a very simple report. We can run this report by one project or by multiple. And if I save it, and I'm going to go back out of here, and I'm going to change my input, and I'm going to say I want to run a report on all these projects, so not just one but multiple. Now that I've already created the report, I only have to select the input for the report and then select the template. And then I say generate report, and then the new input will be posted on the list here. Also a little bit messy, because some of these project names and project and client names are very long. So this would be a way for me to go in and adjust. So it's always good to take different scenarios. So the project name or the client name is here. So then it looks a little bit nicer. And if I save that, that is now my new template. So I've updated the template. So it's just a long list of all the different projects and what they each had, what we had booked versus what we had used. It could also be what we had budgeted versus what we had invoiced or what we had used, and so on. So there's lots of different numbers that you can choose to compare, which is why it's very good to sit down and just think about it a little bit and scratch some stuff on your notepad to decide, well, what numbers is it that I'm really interested in seeing? So that's how you could do that. We could, of course, put some headers on each of these little columns here. So in order to do that, I need to go to the section above, because otherwise farmerswife is going to create a line or a name for each of the lines that it sees in this loop of all my projects. We call it a loop when there's multiple values available. So because we had selected multiple projects, there were multiple project names or descriptions that farmerswife showed. So this becomes a loop when you look at the report. That's how we talk about it. There's a couple of rules that we need to adhere to when we're talking about the print designer, and one of them is you can never mix, or you should never mix, items from your header or from the section above or below with anything above or below it. So in this case, I should never try to line up things from the header with the things from the project section, and I should never try to line up things from the project section with the row section, and so on. They're not meant to line up with each other, and the way that it's built, you might end up creating a massive gap between this line and this line and this line and this line in the loop, rather or creating too little a gap, so then everything ends up crunched up on the same line. So that's one of the main things you have to stick with when you are using the print designer, is to avoid trying to line up things from the same section, from different sections in the same line. But if I want to put a header, I am going to the section above my projects here, so in this case that happens to be the header, and I'm going to add a text, and I'm going to call this one project. Let's make that bold. We can make it a little bit bigger here, like this. So it starts up here on the 0, 0 coordinate because it's the first time I add this value to my report. So that's where all reports will, or that's where all new elements will start, is their 0 coordinate on the page. So I'm just going to push it down so it can sit here. But you see, if I push it too far down, the sections below will move down, which is why you shouldn't try to move things in line with each other. If I stand this one next to the project name, farmerswife will just try to move it down. So hang it up above, and that becomes our header. We have a couple of tips to how we can decrease the gap between the two, which I will either show you later if we have time. Otherwise, I will. We can show it in individual sections if you're in our sessions that we can book after this, if you're interested in looking at something in more detail. This one, I copied it. I opened this one up and I hit copy, and then I took the copy and I moved it across, and then I'm going to change the name to be client. I'm going to do the same here twice, and then one is here. I'm going to move it all the way over, and then I'm going to put this one over here. So this is not the client, this one is our booked numbers, and this one was our used numbers. So it's easy, if you had to hand this report to somebody, it's easy for them to know what the intention was or what numbers they're looking at and values that they're looking at. So okay, so talking a little bit more about these coordinates, because when you're dealing with a loop, and a loop is when there's more than one value available in a particular element, farmerswife not only uses the vertical coordinate as a space on the page, but it also controls the distance between each line in the loop. This means that every value, every element in every section in the print designer has a 0, 0 coordinate on the page, relational to the section above them. So right now we know that this element is asked to be displayed on coordinate 80, which is 80 pixels from the 0 coordinate. So if I used my arrows and I clicked 8 times upwards, farmerswife would reach the 0 coordinate, the 0 point for this value. So they are all sitting on 80. So I'm going to select them all together, and I'm going to use my arrows on the keyboard to move them all up. And what will also happen is that the distance between each one will decrease as everything gets moved up, and the coordinate is gets closer to 0. So you'll see it as we come up here. So it's a smaller list. So this is a much nicer, cleaner report with a lot less distance between it. But if I wanted to create a bigger gap between this header and the values as they start getting listed, but I didn't want to increase the gap between each line in the loop, I can do a little trick where I use the rectangle. The rectangle is a way to make a line in the system, to make a line around something or under something. I can use it to make a box around something, or I can use it as a spacer. And in this case, I'm going to use it to create a gap between the word project and the first value in the loop, which is Alex Brewer. So I'm going to pull it all the way off the page so that when I print it, it won't show, but it still work. And then I'm just going to push it down a little bit. So I push the 0 coordinate for this section, this project section. It gets pushed down on the page, and now it still has the 20 pixel gap between each line, but the 0 coordinate is further down on the page. So I increase the gap between the header and the value. So this is a little tip to use in there. But make sure that you don't put it right on the black line there, because it could be difficult to see it in that case. But if it's right outside the line, you can still see it and work with it, but it still won't print when you hit the print button. And then hit the save button more regularly so you don't lose any of the work that you've done. So that's a way to build, to start to build the report and to use the print designer when you're building it. So I'm hoping that some of these principles will be something you can take away with you. I wanted to show a couple of different other options just to give you some ideas about some of the different reports we can run. This was a very standard, easy report based on just a single project, and it's not broken down to anything else. But I know that some of you are using big projects and you're using binders. And so we have an example of this in this particular database. If we look in the long form calendar here, we have a project called Big City Life. It's quite long. If I open it up, I can see it also has, it's broken into episodes, and we call these binders, the way we break those down. And inside each binder, we also have what we call sub-binders. So we've even broken down the episodes into subsections. And if I then open the subsections, I see the bookings. And if I open the bookings, I'll see my objects. So it's quite a lot of, it's quite a well-organized project, this one. But let's say I wanted to run a report from this project that told me the total value of the project, the total value per episode, and the total value of each phase of each episode. So this is where I'm starting to use my notepad to say, okay, well, what is the first value? Oh, well, the total project is everything. So my grouping 1 would have to be project to get a full total of that. Then I would want to break that down into this level, which is my binder level. And then I want to show each phase, which is a sub-binder. So that's how I would start thinking about building my report. So I'm going to open this project and I'm going to run the report from inside the project. But I could also have just selected it in the toolbox and then run the financial report from there. Now, so I'm going to build the report here. I'm going to call it project by binder. It helps me remember what I meant it to be. Select project in toolbox. Now, group by 1 is going to be project. That's going to give me a total for the whole show. Then I'm going to see every episode's total, which is the binder and binder name. And then I'm going to break the binder into the phases, which is the sub-binder. So it's the binder within the binder. Goes there. And now I've used up my three groupings that's available. So it's going to show up I'm not going to define anything specifically by date range, but and I'm going to use any value or any object that I had in the project. I'm not going to exclude anything. But I might want to try and see if I can make the details a little bit less or a little bit more combined, so that I can see one object in one line and the total value there. I don't need this report to live on my quick pick list for budgeting or for invoicing. And in this report, I definitely need to include the actuals, and I want to make sure that I am pointing to all the bookings. I'm gonna not use the budget for this, so I don't need to check that box. I'm gonna save the settings, and then I'm gonna run the report. It's going to be blank again. So I'll be able to go and say, okay, what do I want to show? If I wanted to put a header on, I could do that. I can put the description, this is basically the name of our project. I can then scroll down to the total section for that, and I can say, I want to show the most relevant available value that is chargeable. So this is what we can invoice for that project. If we were to invoice it today, we would be able to invoice for 146,435. So that's the number I want to break down. So I'm going to move this across a little bit because I know some of these names can be a bit long. So then I keep scrolling down and I know, okay, well, next we said we were going to show binder. Each episode is going to be a total local value as well. So I'm going to show the name of the binders, and then I'm going to show remember this one was to invoice used booked, the cell total. So I'm going to split that into the same value set to invoice used booked. So I'm going to use the same value for this section. So it looks like it's split half and half evenly. And then I'm going to go even further down, and I'm going to split this total into the subbinder. So each subbinder had each episode had two subbinders with phases, and the value we can then show with the invoice used booked again to see the value of each. And this is of course controlled by how much time has been booked and also how much time has been time reported as you go through the project. So this is another super handy type of report, but it should give you an idea of how you would break the information down in the report. There's so many good examples that we could show, and I'm sure that you'll have a lot of questions about specific reports that you want to run. And I'm just going to look at my list here to see what other reports. I think maybe what's very important to show here is, or try and instill a sense of understanding of what these little what these groupings do, because this is really where the power comes in, because farmerswife has so many different numbers that it can draw on and that you can compare. Now, I wanted to, let's say that we wanted to see some kind of breakdown or some kind of comparison with what did it cost and could we sell it for. So here we have a sell rate, but I might show next to that, let's see if I can grab hold of them all together. Okay. And then, so in this column, I'm going to show the buy rate, the buy total. So that will, if I compare these two numbers, this is what I have to pay for this project to complete, and this is what the client will have to pay. So this becomes my sort of the value in the middle is my profit and loss. So let's see, we have these values that we can display, which is the difference between the two. So the total profit and loss is the difference between those two numbers. Now we're just looking at it here per binder, just as the example, but those numbers are available for the binder level itself and for the project level itself. So every loop and every section that you have numbers in will have the same values available. So we can show the profit value. So this is the difference between these two numbers, and we can show that over here. Even a margin value, which is the percentage. Now, and this gives me a good opportunity to show you our string operators. Now, if I have when I have a dynamic value that's pulling from somewhere, and I open the element up to see the formatting, I also have this little window in the bottom right corner, and it's what we call the string operators. And string operators is farmerswife's way of creating formulas on numbers. There's different formulas that you could put on. So these are the different options you have. The first one, string mapping, is a way of replacing a value for another value. It's like a find and replace. A character range is a formula where we ask the system to only show us a certain number of characters. If I only wanted to see this first 3 characters as a code for a client name or something like that, I could use the character range. The line range is a way of limiting how many lines you see if you have a note field, for example, with a lot of text in it, and you only wanted to see the first 2 lines because that's where you put specific information. You can say hide all the other lines, or cap the note field after line 10, for example. So you'd be able to do line range. The split value lets you split the split operator will let you split a value based on a character. For example, if I was to split this post-production, I could use the hyphen in the middle as the split, and then I could say I only want to show the word post, or I only want to show the word production. That would be a way to use the split. I could also split a number here where I split everything on the dot, for example, and then I could show everything before or after the dot. Could also be a way to split date ranges where you show the first date of something and the last date of something. So there's lots of options. The string compare is our way to do one of these. Let me see. It's maybe easier to explain it this way, where we say if this then that is very sort of classic basic coding parameters, where you're saying take this value, in this case the input, and the input is always whatever the result of this element currently is, and then you say, okay, if this input, if the value equals, in this case the 2 inverted commas are quotation marks with nothing in between, means nothing, no value. So we're reading if the input equals no value, return either the input, or we could say return no value by leaving this value option blank. Or we could say show some words instead of nothing. That could be another way to do that. So that's how we're building this. We could also say if you see a number, replace it with another number or something like this. There's lots of different ways that you can use it. And when you look at the options available, again, it's basically looking at all these options here. So you could take any value and wrangle it with any other value that is available to you. So that's what the string operators will do. Now, the next one, that's the one we're going to use right now for this example, is the concat. And concat is short for concatenated or concatenation, and concatenation is just a way of stringing some values together. So I want to string together this value with the percentage sign and a space in between. So that's the concat we're going to do in just a moment. The last one is the math operator, also very, very used if you want to add certain, want to make some calculations on your numbers. Maybe you want to, if I hadn't had this option that was already calculated by farmerswife, I might have wanted to take this value, the sell rate, and deducted the buy rate in order to see what the difference was. So I could use the math operator to do that. and I could say take this value and deduct this value to achieve that value in the end. So the math operator is here where you're saying this part, this value is the input, and then this is the operation, and the second part is going to be whatever value that I selected, maybe the buy total and the sell total, and I would take a minus operation, so I would take this value minus this value, and then I can round up or down or not round at all, and if I am rounding to, for example, the nearest, I can also say how many decimals do I want to see. And then I have the ability to show the number as a number or as a money value. So that depends on how it describes or expresses if it's a monetary value, it will have the commas for the thousands and a dot for the decimals, depending on what your setup in the server is. So this math operator is also really useful. But we are going to use the concat. And the concat is simple as well. We're going to say what part is going to be separated by what two parts or three parts or whatever are going to be separated by which string. So in our case, it's going to be the input. So I'm going to say new input. And then I'm going to say, and then I'm going to put a value. This is where we manually type what we want. So this is going to be the value of the percentage sign. And I want the separation between these two parts to be a space. And then you click OK. It's added it here. You can check it or uncheck it, depending on whether you want to apply it or not. And then you click Apply. And then it adds a percentage sign next to it. So it's very, very handy especially if you wanted to put the currency denomination on here, for example, dollars or euros or whatever you needed. So that was a little lesson in the string operators. They are very interesting, and we are very happy to talk to you about them in detail if you want to set up a session to talk to one of the project managers. We are happy to talk about them in more detail in relation to your specific report, or you can ask questions at the end of this. So our report is saved, and we can now run this report from any selected project that we had, or multiple if we wanted to. So there we go. So that was, I think, enough about financial reports for the minute. I wanted to give you an introduction to what input is available and how you can use your print designer and the settings in the setup to achieve the reports that you need. So we're going to jump to questions next, and I am going to come back here to the PowerPoint. I'm going to skip some of these things, but I wanted them to be in there so that you could see them when you receive the recording. And yeah, so we're going to take the questions now, and then we're going to finish up the session. Thanks so much.